Do not fall into the trap of thinking of your enemy as only being one time period. There are many different times that our enemy has been very different. We must seek to understand multiple different zones. I have no idea where I'm going with this. I will start that one again. Yes, alright, fine. Do not fall into the trap of thinking that your enemy is only one individual. What the hell am I saying? Do not fall into the trap of thinking that there is only one time period that represents an entire people. There are usually many punctuated periods that are greatly different Don't fall into trap of thinking of only one period, no? Change it up. Think about different periods, different times. Trust me.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Campaign Creators Series. Now, we are looking at Japan as our next cultural influencer, if you like the phrase, and we're going to be looking at a very specific period in Japanese history known as the Edo period. Now, this was, as you're going to see, quite an interesting period because it was so not violent, and yet the whole thing collapsed because it was too successful at being not violent. Anyway, it's a very interesting space. It's a very interesting time. I had the wonderful fortune of being able to go to some of the castles and structures and things that were integral to this time period. And so you're going to see some of those videos in today's video as well. So that should be quite exciting. Today's video sponsored by World Anvil. WorldAnvil.com, that world aggregator that we will be using throughout this entire year to store, capture, and create our campaign data as we go along, data, depending on where you are in the world. So that I think is it's super exciting, and thank you to them for sponsoring the video. So let's get on with this. The Edo period spanned almost 250 years, which for a major time period during in the space of Japan, that was quite a long time. It was a really long time, and there was a lot of reform that happened. This wonderful individual, the Shogun Tokugawa, came in and basically just obliterated the enemies. It took him quite a long time to actually effect that, but in so doing, he completely restructured the whole of Japan and started about on a very interesting journey. And that journey was one of a very rigid structure. Now, what I find particularly interesting about the Japanese history is that the emperor and the royal family and the nobles that kind of were attached to the emperors managed to very carefully maneuver their way around so that they remained almost sacrosanct. They were untouchable, even though the country itself was at war and in turmoil and all kinds of things. The emperors and their house managed to stay relatively untouched for almost 1,000 years, which I thought was particularly impressive maneuvering on their behalf. They had the divine inspiration, I suppose you could call it, to position themselves so that the structure had the emperor and, of course, the nobles that were attached to the emperor, and then the shogun. And the shogun was really the military, the warlord, if you like, of Japan, who would, in theory, be responsible to the emperor and would acknowledge the emperor as the leader of Japan, but who effectively ran Japan and who was ultimately in charge of everything. Underneath the shogun, you had the daimyos, and the daimyos were responsible for areas of influence, larger areas, smaller areas, depending on how much favor they had with the shogun, who would strategically arrange the daimyos around themselves, around the shogunate, to make sure that the ones that were loyal were close, the ones that were not loyal were far away and on rather bad land, so that they couldn't ever build up a power base. So that was an interesting one. Then underneath the daimyos, you had the samurai. Those famous warriors that everyone knows about from Japan. The samurai during the Edo period, though, were not these magnificent warriors of ultimate battle and all those. They had that. That was there. But it was a period of peace. There was very little fighting, apart from getting rid of the Toyotomi, who were the ultimate enemy of Tokugawa, but that doesn't matter. the shogun and the daimyos had locked down Japan in such a way that the samurai were converted from these magnificent warriors into administrators. And they were really, really, really reduced in power as well in terms of what they could do. Now, there's a whole reason why they did that. It was very, very smart on behalf of the shogunate, on behalf of Tokugawa to do this, to effectively remove the power base that the samurai had traditionally, which had caused the whole mess in the first place. Underneath the samurai were the peasants. Now, don't think of the peasants as peasants. Think of the peasants as the noble bloodline of individuals, of farmers who worked with the earth, who made sure that everyone was fed. The peasants were, although not important in the caste systems, from a power perspective, were recognized as being the providers and absolutely integral to Japanese society during the Edo period. Underneath them, you had the craftsmen. Oh, you build these magnificent castles. No, you're scum. You really are. Craftsmen were lower than peasants. They were seen as you don't really work for a living. And then below them were the merchants, the sellers, the coin dealers. Now, we're going to get into more of this, but what I found so fascinating is that the lower three ranks, the peasants, the craftsmen, and the who actually started the Edo period as this, untouchable, low class, you can't change, you can't grow out of where you are. And by the end of it, were more powerful than the samurai or the daimyos, because both the daimyos and the samurai owed vast amounts of money to the peasants, to the craftsmen, and to the merchants. It's a very interesting reversal of what can happen during peacetime as to how these things happen. Anyway, it was a very, very peaceful time, as I spoke about. The great katana, that wonderful blade that we all know about, the sword of the Japanese, was in effect a ceremonial dress item and had been reduced in standing quite significantly. It was illegal to carry it in the presence of the shogun, and if you were found carrying a sword, a katana, anywhere near the shogun, as a matter of fact, you would be executed. What happened was it was replaced with a different weapon, the jita, and the jita was quite a different story altogether. It wasn't a blade, it wasn't very big, it was more like a baton, and was designed to catch blades, if the assailant happened to have a blade, or just to basically beat the snot out of your opponent. Very different time, very different time. Education became a primary focus. It's estimated that during the Edo period, in Edo itself, in the capital, 80% of the population were literate towards the end of that period. That's a huge, huge number, especially in comparison to Western counterparts at the same time. So it's quite a dramatic shift away from what Japan used to be, this fairly dark ages feudal society. It started to progress quite rapidly until the end of the Edo period. It was replaced by another period, which we're not going to talk about, the Meiji period, which was even more radical in terms of revolutionizing the country. But it showed that there was an interest, there was a desire to learn about science and the arts. So, like I said, warriors were shifted away from violence and from being these super powerful individuals to administrators and bureaucrats, law enforcement, and basically carrying out the wills of their daimyos and not having that independence that they used to have. And there was a massive agricultural shift. Japan had a large population by this time in their history, and the population wasn't growing. It was fairly static. Lots of peasants, lots of craftsmen, lots of merchants running around, but not a lot of children being made for various reasons. There's a whole lot of theories as to why that was, but we had this rather unusual situation where, with all of this peace and prosperity and learning and development, suddenly farming, this agricultural shift took over, and rice production didn't just double, it increased exponentially, which meant the peasants had so much surplus they could sell it to the merchants could sell it back up to the daimyos, and so this very, very convoluted and very ultimately destructive financial cycle was put into place, whereby the peasants actually started to make a lot of money, the merchants made even more, and the daimyos and the samurai started to lose money en masse, prompting all kinds of reforms and things to try and be put into place. But by then, it was too late. So, talking about how we put all this together is the one and only Dirk. One of the important things to bear in mind when you are looking at a caste-based system is how does it fit together? How do the various levels interact with one another? And at what level are the PCs going to be treated? Now, if it is that the PCs are going to get treated as if they are lowly scum and they have no rights, they can be arrested at any time, there is just a general feeling of ill will towards foreigners, the PCs are not likely to go into that culture, nor would they want to journey with someone who is raised in that culture, for that person would arguably and reasonably have the same prejudice against foreigners. What I always advocate is that if you're going to have a culture that's fairly isolationist, but at the same time you want your PCs to go into that culture, you want them to engage with that culture, and arguably there ain't no reason why you wouldn't want them to engage with every culture that you have in your world. You've created it for a reason. I would always say that if the adventurers arrive in the foreign country, they're treated as foreigners. Make them aware that they're very different. But at the same time, make sure that there's a certain welcoming, a begrudging, you're allowed to be here and we're going to watch you, but we ain't going to act upon your presence here. Doing something like that makes them feel as if they're not really welcome. They're not allowed to be here by virtue of the fact they're not local. But at the same time is not so prohibitive that they won't ever want to go there. They might not have any social standing or might not have any rank within the actual culture itself, but they're still allowed to be part of it and to participate in it with a begrudging amount of, yeah, all right, you can be here. That's the key when it comes to using caste systems and to making sure that they don't work against you and effectively reduce the culture you've created to, that is an area we ain't ever gonna go to because it sucks. Couldn't agree more. Restrictions and castes and systems like that are very important. But yes, you don't want it to lock down too much. You want some flexibility for your PCs anyway. There's got to be some mobility. And there was, in truth, mobility as well. Once you had lots of money, you can do almost anything. And that's true of almost every society out there where there's a caste system. If you've got more money than your betters will often lift you up to their own level, provided that you can pay for it. Anyway, Japan culture was, and still is to this day, very much based around the principles of diligence, doing what you've been told to do, and doing it to the best of your ability. There's no tipping culture in Japan to this day because it's assumed that the person will be diligently doing their work to the best of their capacity. So tipping, saying you've gone above and beyond, is actually frowned upon because I'm already going as far as I can. I can't go beyond that. Anyway, so diligence, honesty. Honesty is an absolute amazing thing. A friend of mine, very good friend of mine, lost his wallet on the trains literally 2 days before this recording. The wallet had quite a large amount of cash in it. 2 hours later, it was handed into the station commander with all of the money still in it. What a wonderful, wonderful experience to be able to get the money back. And of course, the wallet. So honesty is still entrenched in the culture to this day, but it was enshrined during the Edo period. Loyalty, of course, always we want loyalty, but in this case, it really, really was, I don't want to say entrenched, it was inculcated into the peoples of Japan to almost godlike status. Loyalty to one's daimyo, loyalty to one's samurai, loyalty to the shogun. It was definitely reinforced, and you can see for 250 years that space, the Edo period, prevailed because of that loyalty, that dedication to the idea, if you like. And then frugality, and we're going to see how that frugality, don't spend on luxuries, don't spend on these things, actually became the downfall of the entire space, because what happened was when you did spend, you spent big in order to show people that you are frugal, you live in a humble space, you don't have thousands of decorations. To this day, Japan is still very sparse in terms of space and what you have in your space. In theory, of course, that never rings true. People like to collect stuff. We like to have our own little dragon hoards, don't we? Anyway, we're going to see how, and that's the next topic, pageantry. the pageantry started to come through. So we had Geisha, the women who were designed to play music and read poetry and to talk. We obviously had prostitution going on, but that's an ancient enterprise. The Geisha would start to separate themselves from the rest of the craftsmen, from the rest of the merchants, the rest of the performers, by their dress, by their pageantry. The more layered the kimonos, the more intricate the weave of the hair and the jade that would go into it, or the gold that would go into it, or the pearls that would go into it, the better. And so as a result, money was spent en masse to try and look as good. What that meant was that the samurai's wives, the daimyo's wives, would need to uplift themselves as well, and then the men would need to do the same thing. As a result, all those craftsmen, those lowly little craftsmen, started to make a fortune because everyone wanted to buy all of the clothes that they were manufacturing as lowly craftsmen. Ceremonies also started to come into power, where we have these elaborate ceremonies. There isn't war, so what are we doing? We're running rice farms that have been run for 1,000 years. The country is stable. We now have elaborate ceremonies that can take up to days to perform. Those ceremonies require people require payment, and once again, that frugality, the money starts to get spent on all of these other intangible things. You throw a tea ceremony where you need to have all of these things, the fanciest pots, again, made by those little craftsmen. All of those things start to come through. And so you have these ceremonies with grand displays of things. Now, we're not talking the Roman kind of display where we're distracting the masses. We're literally talking about come into my giant empty chamber and have hundreds or dozens of geisha performing, have actors performing, have the ceremony of drinking tea made from teapots that cost a fortune, all made by the merchant, the craftsmen, sold by the merchants, those lowest ranks, upselling to those high ranks. So it's very interesting. And then, of course, patronage. We need to have performers. The no performers, those theatrical performers during the Edo period flourished. It became the shogun endorsed no performance. It was seen as the epitome, the upper class entertainment. Kabuki and all the rest of it was for the lower, those peasants and craftsmen. We don't like them, although they're getting more money than anybody else. So we have no performers, these theatrical, musical, dance type style theater. Sumo was interestingly banned and then brought back in again. That very unusual combat. Now, if you ever watch sumo wrestling, it's full of pageantry. Lots of display, and there's almost more pageantry, more display than there is actual combat. The combat itself is very, very quick. But there's lots of stuff that goes on before that. Having a sumo house requires you to pay for all of those things. So again, we're starting to see where in peacetime, lots of indulgences start to happen, and that costs money. And of course, science. All kinds of interesting things were happening during the Edo period. We started to get not a lot, but a significant amount of influence from the West. Clockmaking became a thing. There was some interesting things going on in that space. There was journeys of discovery across the oceans to see what was happening out in the rest of the world. So there was a lot going on. There really was. Again, though, those peasants, those craftsmen, and the merchants started to emerge as being the dominant space in that culture, even if the upper tiers didn't really even recognize it. Speaking of the peasants, my old mum used to say that hard work always pays off. And that means that if you put in the extra graft to try and make sure that you really are doing what you can do in terms of uniting everything together under a singular banner, then you should have, success and stuff, because hard work is important. And I mean, when you start to delve into this kind of space, you know, where you're learning and things, the more you can learn, the stronger your position will be. So again, I suppose learning is kind of like work, only it's not really work, because you don't likely get calluses on your hands and you don't likely cut your foot with your hoe whilst you're learning. But some people say that learning is like work. So if you do more of that, then you should be better. I think that's what... Yeah, probably. Usually it pays off, not always. So, Warcraft. What kind of Warcraft was there taking place in Japan? Well, as a matter of fact, it was almost anti-Warcraft that was happening. The Edo period under the shogun Tokugawa decided we're going to reduce the number of castles that are in existence. And those that are in existence, we're going to change them up. We're going to make them a little bit more interesting from a cultural perspective rather than from a military perspective. I had the absolute amazing opportunity to go to Matsumoto Castle in this amazing environment, the mountainous regions of Japan, to explore this space, and a good fortune of having a boyfriend who knows how to operate a camera. So thanks very much to Yuya for shooting this whole thing and bearing with me in freezing conditions. Crow Castle, as it's called. Have a look. This is Matsumoto Castle, and what makes it truly interesting of most of the castles in Japan, one, it's one of the original castle structures. The wood is the same wood that has been standing here for almost 400 years. The other is that it was built as a defensive structure. The entire thing, standing just over 90 feet from the base all the way up to the top tower, is 6 stories high and contains little holes in the walls, gaps through which archers and later gunners could actually fire. Now, there's 2 additional towers on either side of the main tentsu, the main tower of the castle, and one of them, the one on the left, contains a room called the Room of the Moon and Stars. Now, if that isn't inspirational, I don't know what is. So many interesting things. You're going to see some more footage later on in the next couple of videos as we unpacked that amazing space. Such a scenic view. Now, why is it called Crow Castle? It's called Crow Castle because it's effectively black, and the pitching of the roofs look like the wings of crows. I think it's a lovely name, Crow Castle. It couldn't get more fantastic if you like. It practically adds itself to your book, Crow Castle. Now, the other thing that we briefly touched on at the beginning of this video, the jitter. The jitter is a weapon. It's about that long. It looks like a baton with a little hook on the side. And very, very simple kind of weapon. Oftentimes they had a blade concealed inside of them, which would have been illegal, of course, to have in the presence of the shogun, but, well, one can't be too careful. Nonetheless, the entire demonstration of this period was a reduction of combat effectiveness. It was a reduction of military might. Again, it was a very simple and very smart ploy. If your enemies don't have castles and they don't have weapons, it's unlikely that they'll overthrow you. And ultimately, the collapse of the Edo period wasn't brought about by a gigantic battle or a war. It was just a very slow financial death, if you like. So Warcraft within this period was very limited and very much on the down low. And that's exactly where we want it to be. I think it makes it a very interesting culture when we add it into a fantasy environment. But we're next week. Right, so the food. Oh, the food of Japan. How I hate the food of Japan. I don't eat seafood or fish, so I was restricted in diet quite heavily. I also don't particularly enjoy fermented beans and things, so the diet got even smaller and smaller and smaller. Sadly, I didn't, but anyway, we had some interesting things that come out of Japan when we talk about the food stuff. Now, sushi very particularly took off during the Edo period. Why? Well, because it's a demonstration, it's a display, it's a craftsman putting together this very beautiful looking food, and oftentimes the food is more about how it looks than how it tastes, but it was about putting together this very beautiful food and then presenting it in such a style and in such a way that it looks really good. Again, this kind of evolved. What's interesting is that there's even talk that the sushi evolved around an area in the capital called Logoku, which is also the capital of the sumo dens and training houses at the moment. The name, of course, completely escapes me at the moment. But it's an interesting one. We go to watch sumo and we have sushi. It kind of developed. It had been going on for a long time before that. It was just sort of refined down. Now, the Japanese palate ostensibly is described as one that's sour and umami, that savory sense that was added to our 5 different tastes on the tongue: sweet, sour, bitter, and the other one, and then umami. Salty is the other one. And then umami, that savory flavor. You can't, but it's on the tip of your tongue. Really it is, but you can't really describe it. Anyway, so that's their kind of space. Fermented rice, fermented beans. A lot of that kind of base is incorporated in their food styles. I don't think the Japanese would ever be described as having a sweet cuisine or a particularly rich cuisine. It's a lot more about broths, boilings, and of course rice as the base. Now that rice, of course, grown by all of those peasants who were making a fortune, selling it off, all of the excess selling off to merchants who would sell to other provinces who didn't have as much. It was a very, very, very convoluted time. Now, rice, of course, being the center of attention for basically everyone, you start to look at how do we turn the stuff into other stuff. And interestingly enough, the rice in Japan, as nice as it is, it's very sticky rice if you haven't ever had Japanese rice before, as opposed to regular sort of Western rice, which is very dry, generally speaking. It's deadly. It quite literally is deadly. There are on average 18 to 20 deaths a year in Tokyo alone as a result of rice consumption in the form of mochi. Now, mochi is very chewy when you eat it. It's almost rubbery. It's a very convoluted way of taking boiled rice and beating it down and turning it into almost like a glue. You can then turn it into all kinds of things, which again fits with the pageantry and the display of the Edo period. You can turn it into all kinds of shapes and you can dye it and color it. It also becomes a very solid basic food group. You can dry it so you can take it as a little block of food with you and then add water and it turns basically into this very stodgy glue-like substance, which if you add sugar or honey to it gets sweeter, or more likely add fish or fermented bits to it to give it that sour umami kind of flavor, which is so popular in Japan. But because it's so chewy, if you take a mouthful of this stuff and you try and chew on it, you might as well have taken a mouthful of rubber bands and started to chew on it for all of the flavor and the chewability of it. So lots of people choke on this thing. So I like that, not because people are choking and dying on it, of course, but because it's an interesting food group that does say, well, I'm not carrying any weapons, but here, chew on this. We look for these things wherever we can. Artusi, help me out. If I tell you that the thing presented to you has the remarkably lifelike expression of a deer in the forest, and the color of the surface of this particular food group is so realistic that it almost feels as if you could touch the fur of this beast, that is a good enough description of the food. You place it upon your mouth and you chew and chew and chew until such a point that you get an ache in your jaw as your muscles are exhausted from mastication in public. All of these kinds of things need to be combined together so that when we're describing food, you're using the senses. That is what food is all about. And specifically when we're talking about a culture like this, where it is all about the visual. It's about overloading the players with those senses. Visually, it looks like this. It feels like that. It tastes of fermented beans locked away in a barrel for years, allowing to rot in their own however you want to describe it. But remember, it's also about expressing how those who are used to eating it consume it. There is nothing more pleasurable than watching somebody who absolutely adores sushi, taking that delicate, bright orange meat atop that crystal snow white rice and popping it in their mouth. And there's that instant moment where the salmon and the rice start to combine together, the sugary sweet vinegar sensation, that savory, salty explosion. and the closing of the eyes and that delicate sighing as the food is slowly chewed away and swallowed. It's a wonderful moment. You should play up these moments. Be a little bit dramatic when it comes to food. Why not? It's what these people did in their culture, and it's what you people should be doing in your games. My people do it. All people do it. Let's be honest. He's so right. It always is about expression, isn't it? It's always about the look, the pageantry. And that really, really, really does define this particular period, I think, very, very well. From a festival's perspective, we've got two that really stick out. Shogatsu, which sticks out in terms of it's the end of year ceremony. It takes a period of 3 days. I was in Kyoto the last New Year session. There are over 1,000 temples and shrines in Kyoto alone. When you think about the size of the city, 1,000 shrines, it's almost one shrine per, at the current population per 1,000 people. I think that was the mass, or per 10,000 people. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a lot of shrines, trust me. They're all over the place. They're wonderful. And you go to these celebrations, which last for 3 days, and there's an entire, almost family ceremony that goes around it. The merchants and those craftsmen set up all of their stalls selling mochi and sushi and everything else that you can imagine that you can eat, whilst waiting in line to get to the head of the shrine and to make your prayers and promises for the new year. So Shogatsu is a wonderful, wonderful time period of celebration. Very little happens, no banking and those kinds of things, as one might expect, but it lasts for 3 days. Hanami is another interesting festival insofar as it's a beautiful festival. Bottom line, the sakura, the cherry blossoms of Japan bloom, and they do bloom all at once in that very small window period in March to April. And suddenly this very, very, very already beautiful area becomes resplendent in in pinks and whites as these cherry blossoms just open up, and it is a spectacular display. We've just come out of a very grayish kind of winter, so these cherry blossoms open up and it becomes absolutely beautiful. Now, what a wonderful festival. It's literally a festival of appreciating the beauty of flowers. Hana, the Japanese word for flower. So we've got this appreciation of flowers. Again, let's tie it all back into that wonderful expression of ceremony, of festivity, of culture. It just encapsulates the Edo period, I think, so very well. That brings us to the end of our brief dip into the Japanese culture, very broad overview. And I think that the important thing to bear in mind is as Kuda said at the beginning, it's just one time period in Japan's history. There's so many more that we could go and explore that have very different feelings, maybe similar food or similar expressions, but very different feelings. There's the warlike period where the samurai were suddenly much more powerful, and then later periods as well, where we have this technological revolution. So don't just look at one period, look at all of the periods. Anyway, I'm repeating what I said at the beginning of the video, so I apologize. Until next time, thanks again to World Anvil for sponsoring today's show, and I look forward to next week, where we take what we have learned about the Japanese in today's video, and we start translating it into a race that will fit within our fantasy world. And when you look at the options, I think you'll agree that there's one race, at least to my mind anyway, that's absolutely perfect. But more on that next week. Hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and that Goblin Bell if you want to be alerted to when videos come out. And a reminder, we have a live show on Sundays, 7 p.m. GMT. Join us for that. And if you are looking for a group to play with, RPGTablefinder.com, our proprietary software that our own web goblin wrote for us, will help you find a group in your area, whether it's at a table or online. Go check it out. Until next week, however, I wish you and yours the very happiest of campaign creation. Often when one has a ceremony or a festival of some kind, there's a journey that the individuals have to go on, from who start at this particular gate or torii, as it would be called in Japan. You journey from here to there, and it's about what happens on that journey, that distance travelled. And in the case of the Jinja, the Japanese shrine, it's all about not walking in the middle of the path. There's a very clear path, and you learn very quickly you don't walk in the middle of it, because that's the procession of the gods. They will walk in the middle, and you have to walk on the side. So oftentimes it's little nuances like that you can throw into your idea, your creation, that bring them to life, because you suddenly go, oh, really, is that I mustn't sort of step here, but I can step there, and it's right, okay. So yes, useful things like that. A little bit of research goes quite a long way, actually. You can't make up every map that you're asked to draw. Well, you can, actually. You probably just shouldn't.